So welcome to Conversations with CAGT. I would love to introduce to you Dr. Rosemary Cathcart, who's been involved in the gifted field for some 40 years. She's an invited member of the Columbus Group. Her work has included founding New Zealand's first full-time gifted education center, leading its nationwide one-day school program, and since 2006, concentrating on professional development work. She's a leading advocate for gifted education in her country. And you can see more on her website, www.giftedreach.org.nz. So welcome, Rosemary. And tonight she will be presenting Is Giftedness Down Under Actually Giftedness Right Way Up? And take it away, Rosemary.
Good evening, everybody. Let's begin with the obvious question. What does it really mean to be gifted? Some people think it means children achieving in the top 10%. Others that it's the top 5% or maybe the top 1%. Some people think it's about academic performance. Others think it covers performance in all fields. Some think it's the quirky kid, the one who's a nuisance in class. Others that it's the absent-minded daydreamer lost in a world of their own. Some people think it's elitist to talk about giftedness. Other people think all children are gifted. And some people think anyone can be gifted if they work hard enough. Other people think giftedness doesn't exist at all. It's just a myth. No wonder we need to ask, what is it really? Yet it's an observable fact that some human beings seem somehow to be capable of working or achieving at a level that's way beyond most of us, no matter how hard we try or how long we practice. I know that no amount of striving would ever turn me into another Maria Callas or another Jackson Pollock, and certainly not another Stephen Hawkins. So how did these people get to be so astonishingly capable? For us as educators, a myriad of questions arise. What's our responsibility in all this? Will individuals like this be obvious right from the start? Or if not, how do we recognize them? How do we support children whose abilities may inherently be way beyond our own? Is high-level achievement the only goal? If not, what else do we need to consider? There are, of course, many other questions we could ask. For example, is parent perception of exceptional ability valid? What about children from cultures other than our own? Do gifted children ever come from socially and economically deprived families? Do genuinely gifted children ever underachieve? But for now, let's come back to that really fundamental question. What does it really mean to be gifted? In seeking to answer that question, we're drawing on around 100 years of research into this topic, research which has increasingly moved from a narrow, achievement-based approach to a more holistic understanding of this complex human possibility. My staff and I are also drawing on our own decades of work directly with gifted children and their families, and we've been lucky to have that to support our work. So to the starting point, giftedness isn't a choice. It can't be taught or learned. It is present at birth. The wee boy in the photo is actually just 15 months old. And you can see he's making some sense of what he's doing and looking at even his physical holding of the material. So giftedness can be identified long before school, sometimes even in infancy, or it might never be identified. Some gifted individuals go right through life unrecognized, unhappy, their potential never developed, often some of life's misfits. So much depends on the knowledge and on the attitudes and perceptions of the people around that child. Parents, other adults, other children, teachers, the school system, society in general. So, what does it mean to be gifted? How does it influence the child's life and experience? How does it shape not only childhood, but the whole lifetime? Perhaps the very best answer ever written comes from researcher Michael Pachowski. He wrote, "This giftedness is not a matter of degree, but of a different quality of experiencing, vivid, absorbing, penetrating, encompassing, complex, commanding, a way of being quiveringly alive." Quiveringly alive. Pachowski was referring to the extraordinary intensity with which gifted individuals perceive and experience life. It is precisely this which makes their responses so intrinsically different from those of other people. They often see long before others see much further, or see more deeply. So understanding this intensity helps us to understand the exceptional abilities we see in our gifted learners. It makes sense that this intense engagement will lead to advanced performance, at least in some areas of learning. But also, and in the end, more importantly perhaps, this also helps us to recognize that such intensity shapes the exceptional qualities we so often find emerging in gifted learners. Compassion for others, deeply felt convictions about how things should be, passionate commitment to causes and to ideals. These are qualities which can create leaders who inspire and guide others. Ability by itself does not drive these crucial human responses. In fact, it's someone's personal qualities which ultimately determine how they use these abilities and skills, whether those abilities are used constructively, wisely, for good purposes, or otherwise. History is richly laden with examples of those who did otherwise, and thus proved the point. Think Hitler, Stalin, Idi Amin, Genghis Khan. Perhaps we should add Putin. How does all of this affect the gifted learner at school? Well, all children's abilities and qualities are reflected in their behaviour at school. Given that inbuilt intensity, a gifted child's characteristic behaviours or traits often differ markedly from those of others in their age groups. For example, when a gifted child's interest is aroused, intense curiosity and desire to know can lead to persistent questioning way beyond what the teacher has allowed time for, and beyond what other children can understand or put up with. Sharp intellectual awareness can help a gifted child to grasp abstract concepts much more quickly and more fully than their peers. But it can also produce a very sharp wit and a sense of irony, which is not always appreciated by others. Heightened emotional sensitivity can generate strong empathy for others, which might be reflected in feelings of distress and anxiety, or which might lead the child into becoming an impassioned advocate for another person or cause. Eventually, perhaps, an inspirational leader in some way. A deep sense of the interconnectedness of all living things can also emerge and influence responses even in the preschool years. In short, abilities reach levels which are determined by the level of intensity this child experiences. Qualities shape how abilities are used and reflect intensity. And characteristics develop to a degree and in a way that is influenced by intensity. Clearly, these characteristic behaviours are also going to shape the gifted child's learning needs. Teaching strategies which are entirely effective with the rest of the class can almost entirely fail for the gifted child. So we see different abilities, different qualities, and different characteristics produce different needs. And there's our gifted child as the little duckling who doesn't quite fit in with the rest of the flock. As if all of this weren't already sufficiently complicated, another reality is that the gifted child's development is almost always asynchronous. All of us demonstrate some asynchrony. We're all much better at some things than we are at others. But in gifted children, as one would logically expect, this is much more marked. For example, one child might show quite extraordinary ability in language development and expression, but flounder hopelessly in maths and be decidedly bored with team games and sports. First recognised by the Columbus group of experts in the 1990s, such discrepancies are not only confusing and frustrating for the child, they also make the child vulnerable to the expectations and criticisms of adults. All too often we hear, if he or she is so bright, how come I can't see it here? When adults do not understand, how can the child? And so we have confusion often for the child. In this situation, what can teachers do? When we collate all of this information, we find ourselves asking, what does it mean for the classroom teacher? First of all, as we've seen, it leads to that sensible recognition that different abilities, qualities, and behaviours lead to different needs. And this in turn led years ago now to the REACH model of needs and to the development of a raft of strategies to implement this model, trialled and evaluated over a number of years in our one-day school program. We will look at some material that will give you access to these strategies before we finish today. But perhaps I can just say here now, generating interest is there as the first thing that we look at, because for so many gifted children, what has happened to them through the process of school is that they have lost interest in learning, or at least they have lost interest in learning as it is represented to them at school. And so the first thing we need to do is to reawaken that interest and work to capture them. The second item we have put in there, developing tools of thought, refers to the fact that for many gifted children, there may be recognition that they need advanced work, but it isn't always accompanied by the recognition that they also need to be taught the advanced skills that they need in order to tackle that advanced work. So we look at a range of things, including observation and logical reasoning, communication skills, and organisational skills, and so on. And then naturally we come to developing intellectual and creative potential, and then equally importantly, to fostering the child's emotional, social, and ethical growth. And we build that into our programs in a number of ways. And lastly, because our gifted children may well go on to become leaders in their fields, going out perhaps to create new knowledge, new ways of doing things, where perhaps nobody else is equipped to evaluate what they do in their future lives. Right from the beginning, we look at evaluating our own learning. From that model, then, we move to the fact that the factors we have considered here have a huge impact on each gifted child, and in particular, they help to shape the gifted individual's identity and life values. Gifted children cannot help but sense their differences from other children, perhaps subconsciously, perhaps acutely. Childhood right through to adolescence is the time when every human being begins to form a sense of identity, of their individual self, of their worth and value to others. For gifted children, that can be a considerably more difficult process than it is for most. For some, the feeling of not being like others, not belonging, can lead to low self-esteem and a negative self-concept. Without help, that can limit their whole lives. But it can also be that inquiring, gifted young mind, allied to that inherent sensitivity, begins to question the circumstances around him or her. Why doesn't everybody feel like I do about teasing other children or about teachers who shout at kids? Why do they make me learn so much stuff I already know? Why don't other kids get upset about what they see in the news? Why don't people who hurt animals get treated just like people who hurt people? Why aren't grown-ups doing more about the environment? How come Mrs. S listens to my questions, but Mrs. B gets impatient? Why are some adults so different from others? How will I do things when I'm adult? Through this process, the gifted youngster is forming the values that will help to guide his or her life choices. Very significantly, gifted individuals are then also likely to begin to form a life vision, which is the ultimate goal of gifted education. A life vision is a concept which gives someone a sense of purpose larger than themselves. It is about so much more than measurable achievement, though that may be involved. In childhood, it can begin very simply. When I grow up, I want to be a writer and write books about experiments and science for kids like me. When I grow up, I want to be a vet and help sick animals. In adolescence, gifted youngsters may attach themselves to causes that help them to articulate their emerging guiding values. SAD, Students Against Drunk Driving, and the Student Volunteer Army, helping after the earthquakes in Christchurch, New Zealand, are examples of such causes. In adulthood, those values can express themselves in creativity, in invention and discovery, in service, in leadership, at a multitude of levels and in a multitude of ways. A life vision continues to evolve and mature as time brings new experiences and insights. It may make a person seem driven because of the depth of their commitment. It can involve pain, disappointment, and hurt. It can involve great joy and satisfaction, even while that person sees the next horizon to reach for. It is here where abilities and qualities weave themselves together to lead to what can be truly visionary outcomes. Above all, it is the ultimate outcome for a gifted life. We put that into a diagram for you. We have called this a holistic definition. We could have called it a child-centered definition because that is where we began. And all of our work, all the work that I do and my staff, is child-centered, with the child right at the heart of things, as you saw in the REACH model. But what we also recognize is that giftedness and the development of giftedness doesn't stop at the end of childhood or at the end of schooling. It is something that is part of that individual for the whole of their life. And that is why we want to trace this right through in this long process. I'd like to take a little time now to just discuss briefly some of the points that we have covered here in this walk through to reach this holistic definition. First of all, we should at once acknowledge that all individuals, not just the gifted, begin at some stage to form some sort of vision of what they expect and want their future life to be. Often this relates to possible future occupations. One youngster is keen to be a mechanic and work with cars. Another wants to go into the building trade. Another dreams of being a fashion designer. Ideas may change as children grow up, but many such hopes are perfectly realistic and do become true. Sometimes someone simply hopes for happiness and a peace that perhaps they have not known so far in life. But gifted children often have a life vision which in some way is about change. One group of senior gifted high school students asked how they would like to be remembered after their lives were over, wanted above all else to be remembered as a humanitarian visionary who helped to make people more aware and more caring about social issues. 2/3 of this group chose this as their first option. The second choice was to be an ordinary person who was loved by others for unfailing kindness and generosity. And those who chose that as their first option tended to choose the visionary as their second. Being a novelist, a painter, or an artist in another field whose work inspired others with its beauty and insight ranked third, while being a scientist whose discoveries opened up a whole new field of knowledge or understanding held fourth place. They were uninterested in the other available options, being a successful businessman who made a lot of money or becoming a famous celebrity. While this was a small group, these findings are in line with the research in the field, which again and again notes the prevalence of ethical sensitivity and concern, emerging even in extremely young, gifted children. Preschoolers who are distressed by others' hurts and rush to provide comfort, who worry about homeless people, who on their own initiative sort out some of their own new Christmas presents to give poor children, who were like that little 15-month-old you see at the beginning of the program, who at the age of 3 responded to seeing a war memorial parade by becoming extremely worried and asking to know, why do people have to go to war and kill each other? In other words, all these responses show children and young people thinking outside themselves and having a larger sense of purpose than meeting their own needs. In many ways, this factor links to a crucially important of the aspect of the material you've just been listening to. Its emphasis on the qualities of the individual. We know of no Western definition of giftedness, which makes this central, as our definition here does. And yet, as we've tried to show, it is precisely those qualities which can so significantly influence the way in which exceptional abilities are expressed and used. Where does this recognition come from? Well, as people living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have the valuable opportunity to connect to the rich insights of Te Ao Māori, the Maori worldview, which is deeply rooted in centuries of history and tradition. This leads directly to the Maori concept of giftedness and links both to the spiritual understanding, which is so central to Maori culture, and to their belief that exceptional abilities are to be demonstrated in service to the community. If you are able, then you use it for the welfare of your community. Yesterday, I received an email from one of our leading Māori writers and researchers, Professor Melinda Webber, and she'd been looking at this material and was commenting on it, and she wrote this. My emphasis has always been on expanding teachers' understandings of giftedness and encourage them to think about what drives the academic, creative, social engagements of Māori children. To my mind, Māori to Māori conversations about giftedness often centre on a child's desire for connectedness to all things, both human and non-human, social belonging and cohesion, intense curiosity and tenacity, and the expression of mana, which is the power, the influence, the self of the person, which is a demonstration in itself of one's connection to tupuna whakapapa, in other words, one's ancestry. Because we are born having inherited the mana of all who came before us. So in some ways, Māori believe giftedness is cumulative, added to by each new generation. It is our mataronga pita ira, in other words, our DNA knowledge. No test will ever measure or capture that. And a schooling system that does not allow a Māori child to truly be themselves will never see their true gifted potential. Many expressions of Māori giftedness in our history were driven by extraordinary social circumstance, potent curiosity, and die-hard tenacity. The navigation of Te Moana Nui Akiwa, the Pacific Ocean, the unmatched design of pa, or their villages and fortresses for war, the building of ocean canoes, the unrivaled knowledge of the Maramataka, the calendar, and so on and so on. How do we help, she concluded, how do we help teachers who believe that gifted kids are only the brainy or perky ones to understand that? This so clearly reflects the sensibilities of gifted children and young people described above, yet it is simply not reflected in so much of what is written about gifted children and practiced in schools. I put it to you, therefore, that the holistic definition I've been describing here today offers an insight which can lead to an understanding of what giftedness truly means and how it shapes both the individual and our community. And finally, as promised, some resource information that you could access, which would help you to read through these ideas and also to look at ways of meeting the needs that we've talked about and the strategies that we have developed and used. And that's all from me, and thank you very much for listening. It's a real pleasure to be here in Colorado. I just wish it was in person. It's nice to do it this way too. So thank you.
Rosemary, thank you. My first impression as a parent and a teacher about the holistic description is that's how we think of our own children. We don't think of their numbers. We don't think of their percentiles. We think of them holistically. And as teachers who love children, we think of them that way as well. And I don't think it's hard to convince a parent that we should look at a bigger picture. And they're so often relieved when we start talking this way about giftedness. So thank you. I want to flip that just a little bit, though. Of course, probably every identification of giftedness in the United States in every state does include numbers and percentiles and academic scores. Do you see that there's a place for that in establishing an identification of giftedness within school systems?
Yes, I do. It is useful to know that this child sitting in front of you is actually reading at a level equivalent to a 13 or 14-year-old. They only happen to be 8. That sort of information is useful. The problem, I think, is that the numbers take over and are regarded as far more important than anything else. And in so many cases, if a child can't show you the numbers, then their giftedness can be dismissed, even although we have a lot of knowledge and experience about gifted children who, for a whole range of reasons, don't actually achieve to those high-level numbers in schools, maybe because their abilities are in areas that aren't measurable, or maybe because they're so fed up with school they're not prepared to try, or maybe because they've learned that to show how clever they are, it's everybody else looking at them sideways, or maybe because, like some of our Māori children, being asked simply to do the numbers doesn't reflect the wholeness that they bring. So yes, there's a role, but it isn't the only role, and it's not first and foremost. It's part of a total picture.
That so many times I have heard what you've mentioned too from teachers, that I'm just not seeing it. And I think when they're saying that, they're maybe seeing some asynchronicity, but they're also not seeing numbers and achievement, and that's where the focus is. And so we'll keep talking, we'll keep educating, we'll keep working on those aspects. I have a question about the developing tools of thought. That seems, of course, it's much broader than you were able to present now. Could you tell us a little bit more about the developing the tools of thought component?
Well, you might remember that when Zuli put his model forward, he had people coming in, and first of all, they moved through stages, and each stage sort of built on the next one. We haven't done that. We've always worked dealing with the whole person all at once. So if we're teaching about one of the tools of thought, then that is very directly linked to the work that the children are actually doing. And you've got an example there. I don't know whether you can still see my last slide with the cover of They're Not Bringing My Brain Out. Can you still see
it's
that?
still
Yep.
there.
Okay.
Yeah.
That picture of a bee that is there was drawn by a little fellow who was 6 at the time. And he did that as part of a piece of work that he was doing, and he was using his observation skills. We regard observation as the first tool of thought, for the simple reason that observation is the first learning tool that all babies use, and all human beings continue to use throughout life. And it's so fundamental that we tend to forget about it. So we very specifically do a lot of things where we involve kids in observation that way, and it gets linked to the work that they are doing. And that's just one very simple example, but we also look at research skills, but we don't just look at reference research, in other words, looking it up. We involve children very directly in hands-on personal research and teach them the skills that are involved in those things. And so on throughout all the different tools of thought. Not sure if that answers your question, but
it does, and thank you for pointing us back to that book. Looks great, and I'm assuming that along with understanding giftedness in a broader perspective? There are some specific strategies for
absolutely.
teachers.
Yep, absolutely. And what we have done there and what we do in the courses we run is that the whole time we draw on examples from children and examples from teachers who've used those strategies and made them work, so that a teacher looking at it doesn't just say, oh yeah, that's all very well for her, she's writing the book sitting somewhere in an ivory tower, not that I am, but they can relate to that and say that's been put forward by a teacher just like me, somebody who perhaps is working at my level in a classroom. Okay, I'll give it a go. And I think that is incredibly important to be able to do that. It
Wonderful.
all comes back to reality,
Yes, absolutely. And what's happening in day to day and at home too. And we have a number of homeschoolers who will tune into to this broadcast or to the videos also. Life vision. What do we say to the gifted child, the teenager who's just full of potential, the multi-potentiality, the kid who's got so many choices in front of him or her or them that they just don't know where to turn? How do we help direct that student?
Whoa, that's a really tricky one. I quite agree with you. And there is no easy answer to this one, because in some ways that teenager has to have an opportunity to try and fail at some of these things. We have which I'm sure you have too, we have a scheme called work experience in our high schools, which has in the past been used primarily for students who are failing at school. But it can also be used for our most highly able students, to give them an opportunity to experience something of what it is like to be hands-on in a particular career or a job. And we also can bring in people who are involved in particular careers. I think there are a lot of individual ways, but you have to kind of look at the individual student to see how you're going to plan this. I think it needs some exposure to the realities in some way, and for kids to learn that a decision that is made now, a choice that is made now about what they choose to do, is not necessarily a choice that they will have to stick to for the rest of their lives. And that too can also be helpful. And loads of information about the possibilities that are inherent in areas that are of interest to them. For example, if a kid is interested in geography, then knowing about the multiplicity of sometimes unexpected jobs that relate to geography can take them off in totally different directions. That's a very rambling answer from me, but it is such a difficult question, and I think it is one you have to look at very individually.
It is, and sometimes I've heard that anxiety expressed from teenagers that I have to choose now and I have to be right because I'm just about to go to college and I can't mess up this choice. That anxiety with that, and that permission to, you can change. Well, related to that, then this is going to be our last question. Then is, I'm 40 years old. This is not me. I'm older than 40. I'm 40. I don't have a life's vision yet. Is it too late for me?
What are you doing being president-elect of CAGT if you are not a person with a vision?
No, this is not me. This is a hypothetical question, as in someone who is 40, someone who is 40 and gifted, and saying, is it too late for me?
No, I can tell you that not because I didn't want to do it before, but because of circumstances, I didn't complete my doctorate until I was, how old was I? 70 odd. Okay. And I'd done it concentrated on it for about 4 years behind that to just get there. And I had always wanted to do it. But in New Zealand, it cost an enormous amount of money to do a doctorate. And then I got invited to do one through an Australian university where I paid nothing at all. And so I was able to do it. So I think that things come up that you don't necessarily expect in life. Always expect there to be another tomorrow. And that's always interesting to explore.
Yeah. And what a wonderful statement to end this on. And thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for helping bring an international flavor in for the Colorado Association for Gifted and Talented. We so much appreciate your wisdom and your insight and sharing the resources with us. All of those things. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now.